sometime back in that era, they had about 32 passenger trains in and out of here. This is one of the busiest stations in New England.
At one time, it was this tremendous. Trains are going in and out of here, freight trains and passenger trains. There were trains going out of here every half hour.
The freight yard was very busy. People that came to visit us couldn't understand how we could possibly sleep at night.
I've been retired now since 1988, and I go around the railroad every day to see what's going on.
This program was made possible by a grant from the Robert Fleming and Jane Howe Patrick Foundation.
The Vermonter runs between Washington, D.C. and St. Albans, Vermont. Operated by Amtrak, it is a new train, but it travels along a right-of-way that's over a century old. It's the only regular passenger service in Vermont. But there are several freight operations still active in the state. One of them is the New England Central, successor to the old Central Vermont. Robert Jones works as a freight conductor for the line. He has combined careers in railroading, teaching, and publishing. His works include a 7-volume history of the Central Vermont.
In 1830, 29 miles of rail line had been laid on the continent. And I think it's significant that in that same year, 1830, a group of business leaders got together in Montpelier and discussed plans for building a railroad that would connect Boston with the Great Lakes and the Midwest.
And the immediate region through which the road passes.
Within 20 years of that meeting, the Vermont Central would be a reality, but it would not be alone. Because in 1843, the Vermont legislature granted charters for 2 competing lines across the state.
West and Canada will find their outlet to all our great cities and towns.
Charles Payne, a successful manufacturer and former governor of the state, led the Vermont Central Syndicate. While Judge Timothy Follett, who had steamboat interests in Burlington, headed up the competition, later to be named the Rutland Railroad. Follett planned a route from Bellows Falls via Rutland to Burlington, while Payne designed his line to run from White River Junction to the Queen City.
The Rutland and Burlington reached the Queen City on December 18th, 1849, and on December 31st, 1849, 13 days later, the Vermont Central's first train rolled into town, so it was a pretty close race.
As rail fever swept the country, communities across New England eagerly sought ways to bring the railroads to their doorsteps. Representatives of the Rutland and Vermont Central traveled across Vermont selling shares.
I guess in the days of railroad building, a town was nobody, so to speak, if it didn't have a railroad. They were eagerly sought for obvious purposes, because before the railroads, transportation is pretty difficult.
Everybody became convinced that a railroad was necessary, and everybody in every little town everywhere wanted one. And from the very beginning, people dreamed of the Great Atlantic and Pacific Railroad.
And they dreamed of making money. Timothy Follett acquired waterfront property in Burlington in anticipation of bringing lucrative traffic to his steamboats. Meanwhile, Charles Payne directed the Vermont Central through his hometown of Northfield, where his substantial holdings included a hotel.
He had a siding, a spur built up to basically the front door of the hotel so that the passengers could get right off the train and go into his hotel to stay overnight. The other thing that this route did was it forever put Montpelier, the state capital, and Barrie on a branch line.
Since investors in Montpelier had bought some $200,000 worth of stock, there was great consternation in the capital city when it was discovered they would not be on the main line. At the same time, John Smith of St. Albans was constructing a rail line into Canada. He decided to connect with the Vermont Central at Essex Junction, later famous for long delays. This maneuver cut the Rutland line off from the north, but it also put Burlington on a branch line. As a result, the Vermont Central now bypassed both the state's capital and its largest city. The Vermont Central would soon be renamed the Central Vermont, and the Smith family would become a dynasty. While the Rutland and Central Vermont battled, other steel roads were building in northeastern Vermont, led by the Fairbanks family. As a lifelong resident of St. Johnsbury, Claire Johnson has been conducting research about the town for a number of years.
It became very important for St. Johnsbury to have railroad transportation in order for the Fairbanks Scale Company to get their products out to the world. And in 1836, Erastus Fairbanks went to White River Junction to a railroad convention as a delegate from here. And he was able to persuade the powers that be that the railroad should come through St. Johnsbury, that it should stay on the Vermont side of the Connecticut River, although New Hampshire was fighting to get it. And this was the beginning of what was called the Connecticut and Passumpsic Rivers Railway. By 1850, it reached St. Johnsbury.
St. Johnsbury benefited from the new wealth. The family and the town would further benefit when a second rail line arrived.
By the late 1860s, you had a real push for an east-west railroad, which would intersect the north-south railroad here in St. Johnsbury. And Erastus Fairbanks' son, Horace, became very active in trying to promote that. He had to sell the New Hampshire legislature on the idea that you could physically build such a thing as a railroad through Crawford Notch, through the White Mountains, which was a tremendous challenge. But Horace spoke well, and he persuaded the New Hampshire legislature to back this railroad through New Hampshire. Came home and got a big welcome here with the band and all the people going to his house to congratulate him.
The new railroad was the Portland and Ogdensburg. The Vermont portion would become the St. Johnsbury and Lake Champlain. Because of the steep terrain it crossed, it was a very slow railroad.
The road was built, they said, if you were following the train, the back of a train, it was like following the trail of a snake because it did wind. In order from St. Johnsbury to Danville, for instance, it was 12 miles by rail, and actually by highway it was only like 5.5 miles.
The St. J and LC Railroad track, a sinuous pathway, wends. It dips and dives and drops and climbs and twists and curves and bends, till through the traveler's dizzied thoughts the fancy chased and ran. This railroad is constructed on the zig-zag plan.
This was a very mountainous run. At the time that I started, we had 8 covered bridges that we used to go through, and this was known as the route of the covered bridges.
The St. J and LC passed through some of the most picturesque country in Vermont, but it was slow and subject to many derailments, not to mention other unscheduled stops.
They were moving along at their usual rate, and all of a sudden they stopped for no apparent reason out in the middle of nowhere. And nothing happened, and finally the lady got up and went to find the conductor. And she said, "What has happened?" And he said, "Well, we ran into a cow, but we'll be leaving now shortly." And so they did, and they went along for about another hour, and all of a sudden they stopped again. And she went up to the conductor and said, "Now don't tell me we've hit another cow." And he said, "No, ma'am, it's the same one. We just ran into her again."
Now retired from CP Rail, Archie had 9 years of his own adventures driving trains for the St. J and LC.
all of a sudden, a guy running down the track stopped the train, put it in emergency, looked down the track. I couldn't believe my eyes. And there was an elephant. So I called the dispatcher and I says, oh boy, we're in trouble again. I says, we're at Wolcott and we're stopped here and we're going to be delayed for a little while. He says, I told you, Archie, don't stop. If you tell the section men, they'll take care of the problem. Well, I says, the problem isn't cows, it's elephant. And he hesitated for a minute and he says, are they pink elephants? And I says, no. I says, they're gray. Matter of fact, 2 of them. What had actually happened was a circus truck on the highway, and he had a high trailer, and there was an underpass there at Wolcott where the road went under the track, and he didn't clear and tipped the trailer over. The elephants got out and got on the track.
Never without problems, the St. J and LC struggled on into the late 20th century. Some railroads had much shorter histories and covered much shorter distances. One of them was a classic.
The Woodstock Railroad, or Railway as it became known after 1890, is generally regarded by rail historians and fans, of which I'm one, as the epitome of a short line, a branch, or a local railroad. It was exactly 13.88 miles long. It ran from Woodstock, Vermont to White River Junction. It was first thought of in the 1860s. And came to fruition in 1875, and for 58 years it was Woodstock's link to the outside.
The greatest engineering challenge on the Woodstock was bridging the Quechee Gorge. The first bridge was wooden with steel reinforcements and spanned the gulf at a height of 163 feet. On August 12, 1875, the old wood-burner Winooski moved cautiously across the structure.
Of course, the first locomotives over it weighed about 23 tons, and by the turn of the century, not only was the wear and tear being taken on it, but the locomotives were now up to 44 tons. And they brought in the current all-steel bridge, and it was built by the American Bridge Company in 1911 for the princely sum of $26,000. That bridge still stands today and is Route 4. When the railroad was disbanded, they sold the road up right away. The state of Vermont, who immediately laid a road there, and that is the basis of the Quechee Gorge Bridge today. So they did a pretty good job in 1911 for $26,000.
Once it was up and running, the railroad provided both freight and passenger service to the area. Dewey's Mills and the Quechee Woolen Mill were steady customers, and the prestigious Woodstock Inn was attracting ever-increasing tourist trade.
At one time, they tell a story that you could go to New York's Grand Central Station and you'd see a nice, what they call an all-varnished car or a luxury car with a sign on it saying, this car for Woodstock. And it would take about 8 hours to get up to White River Junction, and the little Woodstock would pick you up and bring you the last 14 or so miles to the station on Pleasant Street. And starting with a Concord coach, the inn's conveyance would meet you there and bring you to the Woodstock Inn.
Tourists traveled from the depot to the inn by coach and later electric bus. The Woodstock Inn was to become one of New England's most attractive resorts, and the surrounding area would become an important leisure destination. Instead of numbering its locomotives, the Woodstock Railroad named them after men who had provided outstanding service. A.G. Dewey had been president of the railroad when it began construction. The Woodstock's most famous president had achieved success building the Northern Pacific Railroad. Frederick Billings then turned his attention to his home state.
He always did long for Vermont, like many native Vermonters, and when he retired from that, having made his fortune, he came home to Woodstock. And so that's another little unique thing about the 13.88-mile Woodstock Railroad. They got to get a local boy who was former president of a transcontinental railroad to be their president.
Billings died in 1890. In step with other railroads, the Woodstock was about to enter a period of relative prosperity. The glory days were ruled by steam. Today, its fascination and significance are preserved through the efforts of many groups and individuals. Mark Smith publishes books and magazines on railroading and builds steam equipment in his shop at home.
Steam always fascinated me, and when I was a kid, I didn't know why. It just left me kind of moved. The sound of the whistle in the distance, the laboring locomotive with a heavy train, the express train going by so fast that it took your breath away. It can be very, very quiet, almost whisper quiet. And on the other hand, it can blast and labor and thrash and wheels turning.
In the early days, Vermonters themselves built steam engines at places like White River Junction and Lyndonville. But the railroads bought most of their locomotives from out of state.
They would buy the locomotives, and right away, there was maintenance required. Adjusting bearings, for example, inspecting parts for cracks and stuff like that. But also, the railroads did all their major overhaul work. So a lot of sophisticated work went on in towns like Rutland, with the Rutland Railroad. They had complete facilities. Certainly the Central Vermont in St. Albans had very extensive facilities.
They had a foundry that was built in here to make railroad parts, wheels for the cars. There was the National Car Company, which built railroad cars here. There was the St. Albans Steel Mill, which made iron and steel rail for the railroad. Everything grew and grew and grew.
Like other railroad towns, St. Albans prospered. It became headquarters of the Central Vermont, and its buildings reflected the new optimism. Jim Murphy is a trustee of the St. Albans Historical Museum and a dispatcher with the New England Central Railroad.
Well, we're standing on the main line of what used to be the Central Vermont Railway, of course, which was here for many, many years. But just beyond us, by about probably 50 feet, was the train shed, which was built in 1866 and 1867. There were 4 tracks across total, and it had 4 large arches, portals that the trains would come in and out. Freestanding building, nothing in the center to hold up, it was all arched inside. They had to keep changing the size of the portal a bit over the years because the trains got bigger and bigger.
The railroads built their stations to last and to please the eye, and the depot became the focal point of the community. There are many fine examples still standing throughout the state.
First of all, the depot was always a dignified structure. The railroads tended to overbuild everything, their locomotives, their facilities, their bridges and whatnot. Well, they overbuilt the depots, and many of them were just splendid architectural buildings.
This is the Shelburne Railroad Station at Shelburne Museum, built in 1890 by Dr. William Seward Webb, who's father-in-law of Electra Webb, who founded the Shelburne Museum. All kinds of activity went on here. Of course, passenger ticketing, express, freight, telegraph, and it's an interesting station. It's an attractive station. It has 2 waiting rooms, men's at one end, women at the other. I'm not sure that it was compulsory, but women could avoid tobacco chewing, spitting, swearing, and so on and so forth.
The depot was where you met trains arriving from distant exotic places, where you went for news, where you saw a visiting dignitary. It was where you met a loved one. In the old days, the depot was the heart of the town.
Started first in December 1942, working in the engine house here in Bellows Falls as a laborer. And I worked up to the position of a locomotive hostler. Now, a hostler is a position where you handle the locomotives once they are brought in off the road. And you handle them for servicing, that is for coaling, for watering, fire cleaning, turning, and in this particular instance here in Bellows Falls, which was a small terminal, we also were responsible for doing a considerable amount of mechanical work that was within our ability to accomplish. The Rutland, of course, terminated here, and from a historical standpoint, it'd be interesting to note the Rutland was the first railroad in Bellows Falls.
The steel roads connected Vermont communities with each other and with the outside world. In junction towns like Bellows Falls, the growth was impressive.
Well, you had the CV running through here, the B&M, had the Rutland coming in here. It was a main line from Boston to Montreal. About 10 trains a day, 10 or 12, and they had switchers working it in 3 different yards here. It was a booming railroad town.
Business was booming for Vermont Farm Machine, who shipped their goods far afield.
Vermont Farm made what they called a Davis swing churn, which was all wood, and you rocked it back and forth like a cradle. They also had barrel churns that turned. And that was one of the big industries here. They shipped all over the world.
The railroads brought new trade and prosperity to the towns they served. Salesmen arrived by train and stayed at busy hotels. Milk and other agricultural products traveled out of the state. Goods and people moved through at an ever-increasing pace. The Rutland had always sought to outflank the central Vermont. Back at the turn of the century, it devised a spectacular plan.
The causeway across Lake Champlain between Colchester and South Hero came into being in 1900. And again, this was to bypass the central Vermont, because up to that point, in order to get to the west, they were obligated to go over the CV between Burlington and St. Albans and thence over to Rouse's Point.
Thrusting more than 3 miles across open water, the causeway provided direct connection with the west. Rutland trains would thread their way along it for the next 60 years. Huge slabs of scrap marble were used as fill along the causeway, now empty of the traffic which used to rumble across the lake.
We camped for years at Colchester Point, where the long Rutland fill took off across for South Hero. And the arrangement, the way the trees were and everything, when a northbound train came along, you knew it was coming. You couldn't hear it very much. As soon as it got free of the trees, it was almost like a loud explosion.
In the Rutland's case, they finally did achieve some sort of practicality, because they were a link between a greater network of traffic between Boston and Chicago and the Midwest, by virtue of the fact that the trains could come up to Bellows Falls and then go on the Rutland up through the causeway that was built across the islands. It was the glory years for the Rutland when that particular situation was in vogue.
For some people, the glory years meant opulence and luxury. Dr. William Seward Webb was ambitious and well-connected. Thwarted in his plans to become governor of New York, he sought that office in Vermont.
He married a Vanderbilt girl, which tied him in with the New York Central, and the New York Central sent him up here to see if the Central wanted to take over the Rutland Railroad. And they decided against it finally, but when in Vermont, he fell in love with the countryside and established what is now Shelburne Farms.
As president of the Rutland, Webb toured the rails of the line aboard the luxuriously appointed inspection engine, Nahasene, which he had brought with him from New York.
I also should mention that he was president of the Wagner Palace Car Company, which built the Grand Isle, which is here also at the museum. It's all mahogany panel. It seats 10 people. It has an observation room at the rear by the platform, 2 bedrooms, dining room, secretary's room, and a room for the porter or cook.
Dr. Webb never became governor of Vermont, but the Rutland Railroad was profitable under his management, with a good deal of support from the New York Central. It was an optimistic time, but railroading has never been without peril. Perhaps the most vivid example was the disaster at what was called the Woodstock Bridge. Today, at West Hartford, a steel bridge crosses the White River. A century earlier, in February 1887, it was made out of wood. It was here that the Central Vermont experienced the worst train wreck in its history.
The night train coming north out of White River Junction struck a piece of rail which had a break in it. The rail was actually broken out.
Some of the cars toppled off the bridge, off the trestle, onto the frozen White River. The oil lamps and the stoves that were in each car immediately caught fire.
But not only did it just burn up the cars, but because the bridge was also wood, it completely burned this 4 or 5 span bridge also, and there was nothing left when the fire was done.
When it was all over, there were 25 passengers dead and 5 crew members were also killed.
After it rebuilt the bridge, the Central Vermont loaded it up with a dozen locomotives to demonstrate its strength. A decade earlier, a remarkable feat of engineering had been completed in the White Mountains of New Hampshire. A group of railroad enthusiasts have gathered at the train station in Conway, New Hampshire for an historic event. Gordon Evans and his brother Raymond have joined members of their family for the occasion, the first passenger train through Crawford Notch in 37 years. The Conway Scenic Railroad is launching its new excursion line to Crawford Station on the tracks of the Maine Central Mountain Division, descendant of the old Portland and Ogdensburg Railroad. For the Evans brothers, the trip has special meaning. It will take them past the house high on Mount Willard where they grew up. The train works its way to Bartlett through the beautiful Saco River Valley. The stop in Bartlett affords an extra photo opportunity for rail fans. In the days of the Mountain Division, Bartlett was a busy station, handling passengers and freight traffic bound for distant locations. Here, extra power was added for the steep ascent which lay ahead. For the steam locomotives, the climb through the notch was a real challenge. The railroad gains almost 1,400 feet from North Conway to the Crawford Station. There is one section 9 miles long that rises at a rate of 116 feet to the mile. To haul the heavier freight up the grade, helper engines were added at both ends of the train. Today's train ride will carry the Evans brothers over familiar ground. At the site of the old Bemis station, now known as Notchland, there is music to celebrate the event. Trees have filled the once open ravine below the spectacular Frankenstein trestle. The train passes over Willie Brook Bridge, approaching the site where once stood the section house that was home to the Evans family during the early years of the century. The house was built in 1887 for workers who maintained the 2-mile section of track carved into the side of the mountain. In 1903, Loring Evans, the father of Gordon and Raymond, was hired as a section foreman and moved into the house with his wife Hattie.
Once a week, she'd send an order into G.K. Howard. He was the one that had the store in Bartlett. And what she'd want for the week, they'd put it on the train, the baggage car, and sometimes they'd take it to Crawford's and the section men would take it down, or sometimes they'd stop at the house and put it off at the house.
The railroad was their main link to the world. It brought coal, groceries, and clothing from the valley, and it brought the doctor who delivered the 4 Evans children. It was also the railroad that carried the children to school. Because of the steep grade, an unusual method was devised for getting them aboard.
we went to school at Fabens, and the train in the winter could not stop because it went on a curve, and he'd just spin, sit there and spin. And my mother would space us 40 feet apart or something like that, and the conductor and the brakeman probably would scoop us on.
The winters on the steep slopes of Mount Willard were rugged, and the deep snows always a threat.
Well, we had a lot of snow in those days. We had monstrous snowslides off the ledges of Mount Willard. And then we had a telephone in the house, and then when the snowslide came, we had to call Bartlett so they would send a snowplow up ahead of the passenger train or freight train.
It was snowing on Thanksgiving Day in 1913 as Loring Evans cleared switches at Crawford's.
Well, it was a stormy day, and of course the engine was, he thought it was going to go on to Fabens. Evidently they backed up onto the sidetrack, and he was shoveling the sidetrack out, switches and everything.
He misunderstood the engineer's signal and was struck and killed by the backtracking helper engine. Hattie was left with the 4 children and a decision to make.
Well, afterwards they decided to talk with her. She could stay on and board the section men, leave, whatever she wanted to do. Of course, then she didn't know anything different, so she stayed right there and boarded the section men. And we lived in one part of the house, one side of the house, and the section crew lived on the other side.
Hattie raised her family and continued to cook for the section crew. She would remain on the mountain for another 30 years. Passenger trains would continue to run through the Gateway and on into Vermont until 1958. After ceremonies at the Crawford station, it's back through the Notch and down the mountain. For each traveler, the trip has its own meaning. For the Evans brothers, it has meant revisiting the pathways of their early years and reliving some special moments. Rain was coming down hard on the 3rd of November 1927. People in northern New England were not surprised. October had been an unusually wet month, but this was a torrential storm lasting 2 days. The ground was saturated and the rivers were already swollen. It would prove to be the worst disaster in the history of the region for its people and for its railroads.
There were always wrecks up and down the line, but the 27 flood, November 3rd and 4th of 1927, happened at a time when there were no flood control on any of the rivers.
Dams broke at various places, culverts washed out, and when it was all over, the state's railroad system had been virtually decimated.
At Proctor, the station almost floated away, and the tracks washed out under Rutland's milk train number 88, stranding it and its crew. The city of Rutland was not spared, as the raging waters destroyed rails and bridges. Though the flood crippled the Rutland Railroad, it all but destroyed the central Vermont.
Everything on the Central Vermont Railway, almost from around Sharon, Vermont, up to Williston, almost every bridge and all the road bed, everything was completely annihilated. The head of the railroad here called on the Canadian National to help out to rebuild the railroad. And they sent down, I believe it was somewhere around 1,600 people, along with equipment, to rebuild the railroad.
It was a monumental effort. The main line was back in service in 3 months, and a ceremony was held on the steps of the Capitol. But the Central Vermont could not pay the bill for the reconstruction.
Well, the CV had no choice, but they had a foreclosure sale. And at the foreclosure sale, the representative of the Canadian National Railway purchased the Central Vermont Railway for $22 million. And Canadian National took over control of the Central Vermont from that time on.
There were virtually no railroads that escaped unscathed. Some of the marginal, smaller operations, this was the end. They just didn't have the money. They didn't have the economic future to even rebuild, even think about rebuilding.
In the early 30s, many of the short lines in New England disappeared, battered by the flood, the Depression, and the steady advance of the automobile. Following its early financial struggles, the Woodstock Railroad had enjoyed a period of success, but revenues had been declining steadily throughout the 20s.
The decision was made in '32. The handwriting was on the wall. It was one of those things that had been our little railroad. No one wanted to face it, but there was really no choice. It was decided that the last run would be made on April 15th, the day before Easter in 1933, at the very height of the Great Depression.
Remember, I was 16 years old at the time, and the Woodstock Railroad station and that had always been my playground as a kid because I lived right across from the railroad right there. And so I was anxious to go on the ride. So I know we went down to the station early and stood in line to get a ticket. There was quite a few people going, a little small office there. At 11 o'clock, Ivan McCarty closed the ticket office. Charles Ferber came out and saw that everyone was on board, and he called to H.H. Payne, who was the engineer, to go ahead. A man by the name of George Piper was the fireman, and the train pulled out of Woodstock shortly after 11 a.m. Just beyond Dewey's Mills is a slight elevation called Shalley's Hill. And the train started up that hill, and the wheels kept spinning. It didn't get anywhere.
Somebody put axle grease on the rails, and the train had to make 3 passes to climb up over this steep grade.
Sometime within the last year, someone came out and put a piece in the Vermont Standard, our local newspaper, to admit that he was one that was involved in that.
Finally, they got up over it and had their luncheon in White River, and the train reversed for Woodstock, tolling its bell all the way home to its depot. I've also had people tell me of various ages in the village that throughout the whole thing, people turned out to wave goodbye to it. The engineer acknowledged every one of them, and more than one tear was shed on that day.
A number of Vermont towns had another form of rail travel which thrived for a brief period. Bellows Falls was no exception.
Now there's one of the trolley car in front of the old town hall. Now that one burned down in 1925. The reason they stopped there, they had the contract to haul the U.S. mail out to Saxon's River. Bellows Falls and Saxon's River Street Railway. They got it running in about 1900. Ran from the station, Bellows Falls, up to the business district, went out to Gatesville and the Saxon River, about 6 miles.
On the way to Saxton's River was a place called Barber's Park. This was a popular destination for people in the surrounding area and provided all kinds of recreation.
In the old days, you got there for about 15 or 20 cents. And they had big doings on 4th of July, and I just seen it here when one 4th of July, about 1902, they had 6,000 people rode the trolley out there. That was a big day. They had ball games, they had free band concerts on Sunday night, they had movies out there, and they had a lot of, well, what you'd call summer stock today. They had shows out there. Now, this one here that's the car stopping at the ball field out to Barbers Park. And the game must have started because they're all bailing off of there in a hurry.
As would soon be the case with steam locomotives, the trolleys of New England would disappear, brought down by an agent of change that didn't ride on rails.
It was the automobile. When Henry started putting out Model Ts, everybody started getting a car, and they didn't want to ride the trolley anymore. There wasn't enough business, so they finally went bankrupt in 1925. And shortly afterwards, they tore up the rails and stuff.
The Rutland went into bankruptcy in 1938. And there was some pretty tough times immediately following that. There was a lot of question whether the railroad could survive. Among the various ideas that came about, and probably one of the most successful was the Save the Rutland Club, which was organized, and they succeeded in hiring professional traffic people to come in and help improve their traffic base. One of the ideas, of course, was the inauguration of a fast freight service, as they called it, train, and the train was called the Whippet. They were able to offer good service, and they offered it at a slightly reduced rate, which was an incentive to the shipper. This was one of the successful ventures that the Save the Rutland Club came about with, and it did increase their traffic to a considerable degree.
Other lines emphasized more glamorous features in their promotions.
Once upon a winter's day, Grand Central Terminal hummed with excitement. The Snow Express was about to depart. It's best to get your tickets early for when departure time...
Starting in the early 30s, ski trains ran north out of cities like New York and Boston. Except for the war years, they continued throughout the 40s, bringing skiers to the resorts that were springing up in New England.
For a weekend in Vermont or New Hampshire or in Canada.
And you pulled out of Grand Central and chugged right along the New York, New Haven, and Hartford, changing engines in New Haven as usual. And then after that, you really didn't know much about it because you were in bed and asleep. You were awakened by the change of the engines at Dover. They stopped in Ossipee to let people off, and they stopped in Conway and North Conway, and then Intervale was the end. And then you had breakfast, and then you were all set pretty much to go off to ski school, which started at 10.
Across the river in Vermont, ski trains also race north, carrying skiers to the slopes around the state, including the trails on Mount Mansfield at Stowe. Ski instructors were on hand to help novices and advanced skiers alike perfect their techniques, and maybe provide other diversions.
Well, besides skiing, I met a very attractive ski instructor. And it took me 2 or 3 times coming before he really noticed me. So that was the beginning of, we've been married now, 54 years nearly.
The ski trains disappeared as passenger and freight service gave way to the advance of cars and trucks. Once again, the Rutland was struggling, but things would change with the arrival of a new president, Gardner Caverly.
And he brought about what is termed and what I feel was a rebirth of the Rutland. When he came on board, there was about 60 steam locomotives still in existence on the Rutland. A study was made, a professional study made, and it was found that the Rutland could be operated with a total of about 15 diesel units, where it took about 60 steam engines. And he was successful in getting banking to start dieselizing the railroad.
Across the country, diesel power was pushing steam locomotives onto the siding. Vermont was late to make the change, but it was inevitable. The demands of efficiency were writing the final chapter of a remarkable story.
This is the steam locomotive, number 220. It's a 488, you know, it normally was built for passenger service, but we did use it in way freight service. And but it hand-fired engine, and that was the old glory days. They called the shovel, as you shoveled in the coal, they called the banjo. And if you could play the banjo good, you would be all right.
Jim Fendley came up to St. Albans from Alabama in 1946 and went to work for the Central Vermont as a fireman during the last days of steam. 6 years later, he was on the roster as an engineer.
I fired this engine back when we had the steam. I fired this engine. I fired many others, but this one they used sometimes in a way freight, use it in a passenger train. When you start your train, you let off your brake. You have that down there. You pull it out just a little bit, and you get it started. Get the slack out of the train, you know, and as you got going, and you got on the main line where you could highball, then you keep pulling it out, and you bring this bar wheel on up here. And this is the old called a Johnson bar. That's your gear. You hook it up and lower down low and work it real hard. Or when you're out there highballing, you bring it up here real high, almost up near the center. This is the valve which furnaces steam with the ratio that you set with the Johnson bar up in the cab, puts steam into the piston and drives it back and forth. It'll come in and up, push it back, and then it'll come back in and push it forward. It's top 8, back 8, top and bottom quarters. Forward 8, back 8, top and bottom quarters. That's the ratio is set up.
During Jim Fendley's early days as an engineer, a strict timetable applied to all trains, whether passenger or freight.
The first train I got was the milk train from St. Albans to White River. And those days they were hot on the running time between stations. And if you didn't make your time between stations, boy, they'd be on your neck. The wires would get hot. You'd have to write on a note and tell them why you didn't make your running time. So that was back in the old railroad days where they were real railroad. These diesels, you know, that took all the thunder out of railroad. The old steamers was it. Just loved the old steamers.
Woody's eating out the garden.
Some retired railroad employees have gathered for their annual luncheon at White River Junction. About half the men work for the Boston and Maine, the others for the Central Vermont. White River Junction was once a very busy railroad town.
I've seen times when I started in the first part of the 50s where that platform down there was literally covered with people. There's trains sitting on every track. They just came in or they're getting ready to go.
Well, I worked in White River Junction as a telegraph operator. I worked third trick most of the time, and work relief job here. We had 3 sets of operators here on the station and 3 down on the yard.
Today, freight traffic through White River Junction is sparse, and passenger service is reduced to the single daily trip that Amtrak's Vermonter makes in each direction.
And on this side was the main station. This was the express office, Railway Express. And this was the baggage room here. And the main passenger station was here. They had a restaurant in there where you could get a pretty good meal.
For the railroads that came to this town, freight trains paid the bills, and passenger service brought the prestige. White River Junction had its share of both. From Montreal, trains arrived on 2 routes, the Central Vermont and the combined Boston and Maine Canadian Pacific line.
Sometime back in that era, they had about 32 passenger trains in and out of here. I've seen times when the B&M yard, they had 17 tracks, a set-off track, and a running track. And every one of those would be full of freight cars. This was one of the busiest stations in New England.
Like the Central Vermont, the Boston and Maine had its glory years. It maintained an extensive network of tracks in New Hampshire, and B&M trains were a familiar sight in Vermont as well. The line was a favorite among photographers, and during the final days of steam, its classic features were documented by many people, most notably by Philip Hastings.
Phil Hastings was brought up in Bradford, Vermont, which is on the Connecticut River, and also on the Boston, Maine, north-south main line between White River Junction and Wells River. And right from the start, his photographs had a unique quality. Phil had the sensitivity and the awareness to make each one of his pictures a composite. He saw it all. One of my favorite pictures was taken at Bradford just at twilight, and it was along the train, and the RPO clerk was loading the last of the mail, and what you saw was a community at train time.
Although the short lines are almost entirely gone, the trunk lines in Vermont are still active. While passenger service is more glamorous, freight has always been the revenue generator for the railroads.
The railroad industry right now is probably as healthy as it has been at any time in history. The railroads are handling more freight than they did at any time in history, including the peak years during World War II, which were the previous records.
Today, the New England Central hauls freight along the same road traveled by the CV. And because of decisive action by the state of Vermont, the old Rutland tracks are still in use.
The state got into the picture and purchased the right-of-way of the Rutland Railroad. And they did this with taxpayers' money, and I think legitimately so, in order to preserve the opportunity to have rail transportation within the state. And likewise, it was the case with the Bellows Falls branch from Rutland to Bellows Falls. And that's operated by a different company, the Green Mountain Railroad, but they're doing very well too. And interestingly enough, on the Bellows Falls branch, they run a tourist train, which has been very successful for a number of years.
The Green Mountain Flyer carries passengers through historic Vermont landscapes from Bellows Falls to Chester and back. In restored wooden coaches, complete with varnished interiors and plush upholstery, travelers can experience something of the magic of railroading as it used to be.
The train is part of the landscape. There's a look-alike kind of homogenized quality to traveling nowadays. But in railroading, the railroads always traveled through the landscape, whether it's meadows or mountains. It's a unique encounter with the landscape.
The railroad industry, as the saying goes, gets in one's blood.
What starts it, I don't know. It just gets in your blood.
I've been retired now since 1988, and yet I go around the railroad pretty every day to see what's going on. Oh, it seems to get in your blood, I don't know. Yeah, for some reason it does. You get attached to it and you stick with it. You stick with it.
This program was made possible by a grant from the Robert Fleming and Jane Howe Patrick Foundation.